Without further ado, then, I've got a number of things. It's going to be a busy 45 minutes. Okay, and now here we go. There's my title, Indigenous Amazonian Peoples and the Struggles for Environmental Justice in South America. An overview of the presentation is from what I was discussing with Carol. We're going to start with just a very general introduction to cultural anthropology.
I wonder if you...
Okay, just a second, because Jonathan, you have to unmute yourself. Somebody asked me to mute people, and in doing it,
You muted me, okay.
I did. That wasn't my plan.
Let's see if are we back up? Can we see it?
You're going to have to reshare your screen.
Yep.
Okay, I will reshare. Coming up. Yeah, I got to reshare. Let's go to Zoom and share. And now we get in there. Okay. So can everyone hear me now? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, good. It's going to be a busy 45 minutes. We're going to survey cultural anthropology, ecological anthropology, the ethnology of lowland South America, that's the Amazon basin and adjacent areas east of the Andes, contemporary environmental problems with particular emphasis on the maladaptive cultural systems being put in place by contemporary Brazilian society, and then indigenous eco-cosmologies, that is the Coripacu people with whom I did my research in the 1980s and 1990s, and a few concluding thoughts. So fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a very quick overview of a lot of different materials. Most of these are things that I would teach in a semester or even a year-long course. So, but don't worry, there won't be a quiz at the end. My teaching days are over. So cultural anthropology, in a very short nutshell, begins with the transition from 19th century universalist approaches to culture as a rational, conscious thing, a kind of a yardstick that people have more or less of. And of course, the Western male white writers, European and North American writers, were the ones who had the most culture, and everybody else had less culture than they did. In order for a modern cultural anthropology to emerge, that concept had to be pushed aside in favor of a more relativistic understanding of cultures plural. And that was done by Franz Boas, primarily in the United States. Starting with the discovery of linguistic relativism, Boas in 1888 discovered that really there is no such thing as a primitive language. And from there, it was only a short step to realize that there's no such thing as a primitive culture either. All cultures are different. That doesn't mean they are can be ranked in some way on a unilinear scale. So with cultural relativism firmly in place in the 20th century, we began to see some of it, sometimes it would be pushed too far. When we push cultural relativism and linguistic relativism too far, it becomes cultural determinism or hyper-relativism. In other words, the idea that there is infinite linguistic and cultural variability as we look across humanity. And in fact, we know that's not true. Scientifically, it's not true, because when we compare cultures from all different regions of the world, we find distinct patterns that emerge, even though there's been no historical connection between these different societies. And likewise, we find distinct patterns in linguistic patterns in languages that are not genetically or historically related to one another. And furthermore, we know from our own experience that individuals can become multilingual or multicultural. That is, they can learn to speak different languages other than their native tongue, and they can learn to navigate in other cultural systems if they want to. So we have to find ways to get out of that kind of hyper-relativism. And one way we've been doing that recently is by shifting from a focus on culture and cultures in a sort of a noun sense. That is, it's easy when culture is a noun to objectify it and turn it into a thing, to reify it. So it's better if we use an adjective, cultural practices, and look at the way those are always situated in dynamic long-term processes of historical change and power relations. Okay, from cultural anthropology, we go to the specific field of ecological anthropology. The problem for cultural anthropologists to study cultural adaptation is we don't have a concept like fitness. In biological sciences, we have the concept of fitness that we got from Darwin and Mendel and population biology that allows us to measure, should I admit this? Yeah, I'll just admit people as they come popping up.
Oh, I can do that.
You can do that? Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. It allows us to measure the differential reproductive success of populations and gives us an objective handle on which adaptations are successful and which are not. One way we can try to break out of the problem is by looking at the ecosystem concept, which was developed by Eugene Odum in a book called The Fundamentals of Ecology in 1953. Basically, it's the idea that all life forms are interrelated and interdependent. That think of the food chain, for example, that if you kill all the predators, then some of the rodents and other animals overpopulate and you get an imbalance and so forth. The other thing about the ecosystem concept that's important to emphasize is it's not just the organic or biotic species and populations and organisms, it's the relations between those biotic components and the abiotic elements that are necessary for sustaining life, such as solar power, water, oxygen, minerals in the soil, and that sort of thing. And it's the exchanges between biotic and abiotic elements that ultimately define the ecosystem concept, or we can define it in terms of energy exchanges. And then, of course, the concept that I've been developing in my own writing is indigenous Amazonian ecocosmologies, and we'll talk a lot about those in a minute. They basically come from the idea that the cosmologies or religious belief structures of indigenous Amazonian societies are in many ways analogous to, and in some ways overlap considerably with, the ecosystem concept. So in a very general way, we can differentiate between profit or yield maximizing ecosystems and survival maximizing systems, or we can call them perpetual growth economies versus sustainable communities. Perpetual growth economies are also sometimes called high energy cultures. They involve high consumption of energy per capita. In the United States, roughly 230,000 kilocalories of energy per person per day is consumed. High subsidies of energy, that is, massive amounts of, most of that energy is not from the individuals themselves, it's from these oil, gas, slave labor, immigrant labor, whatever goes into the production of food that is consumed by people. And it tends to be very specialized. That is, the niche is characterized by large numbers of individuals and small numbers of species. And the perfect example of that, the quintessential example, is monocropping, where you have a single field or a single area cultivating only one single crop, like corn or something like that. And the other related concept of perpetual growth economy brings in the idea of a constant movement from the exploitation of one set of resources to another. So when the whales are exhausted and the turtles are destroyed in the Amazon to make oil to burn in lamps in 19th century North America and Europe, then we start digging coal and we start burning coal for heat and making steam engines, locomotives, and so forth. And then we go on to oil and gas and so forth. It's just this kind of constant movement from one source of energy and source of materials to another. And in fact, I think this is really the quintessential dilemma of humanity, is how do we get out of this perpetual growth economics, which really begins with the expansion of Western European colonial empires into the Americas and Asia and Africa, and the extraction of massive quantities of indigenous and African and Asian slave labor and natural resources, and which continues today. I mean, if you want to look at the inequality in our world system today, it's a perfect mirror image of the colonial empires that expanded through the colonial period. In contrast, indigenous cosmologies are eco-cosmologies are based on this principle of sustainable communities that have low per capita energy consumption, which are very high in efficiency, meaning there are more calories of energy taken, which are coming back to the human consumers than are put in. So on the worst soils in the Western Hemisphere, the Coripacu people, where I worked in the Rio Negro, are getting 10 calories of energy out per 1 calorie in their slash and burn bitter manioc cultivation, which we'll talk more about later. By contrast, factory farm fossil fuel production of food in the United States gets about 1 calorie out for 50 calories in. So that means that the indigenous system is about 500 times more efficient than the contemporary fossil fuel systems. Okay, so before we go on to talk more in general about lowland South America, I want to talk about these Amazonian eco-cosmologies. Indigenous Amazonian worldviews and cultural practices demonstrate a profound appreciation for the connections between human and non-human beings. And nowadays, instead of non-human, we're talking about it as the other than human beings, because it seems a little less negative. Natural species and material elements are not relegated to the status of mere things or resources that human beings must confront, control, and consume, but rather are celebrated as a communicative living being that must be heard, listened to, and spoken, chanted, sung, danced, and otherwise made into being through the rituals of everyday life, as well as larger collective rituals and ceremonies. These eco-cosmologies must be understood as complex, endlessly changing, mythopoetic processes of transforming other than human species and materials into fully human persons and communities that are simultaneously differentiated from the other than human world of plants, animals, and substances, as well as deeply and inextricably connected to these other than human environments. And I'm going to stop here for just a second and say, you're going, what? Mythopoetic? And I'm going to hopefully explain to you what a mythopoetic cosmology, cosmological process is. And I also want to emphasize the fact that, yes, there is tremendous integration and interdependency between recognized in these cosmologies between the human and other than human worlds, but that does not mean we can reduce them somehow to, you know, natural man living in perfect harmony with nature. That is just as dehumanizing as looking at them as lawless savages. So the concept that I find most useful for explaining mythopoetic transformations is the mythic primordium. It's a little like the Australian Aboriginal concept of dream time. That is, it's a time when there's no clear distinction or separation between the humans and other than humans, humans and animals and plants. Not a clear distinction between male and female humans, between animate life forms and material elements. Neither time nor space had been differentiated yet. And the world consists of only a single place that is neither here nor there, but both at once. Time has not yet been divided into days and nights, wet and dry seasons, youth and adulthood. From this primordial soup, specifically male and female persons, as well as fully human forms of social order, emerged through a series of poetic transformations. The pathways leading from the primordial mythic times to the fully differentiated human families and communities are not linear and unidirectional, but they can be traveled in a multitude of ways and directions through ritual and ceremonial performances in what amounts to an endlessly creative process of shaping and reshaping primordial formlessness into culturally and linguistically specific patterns of form and meaning. Indigenous Amazonian cosmologies are not anthropocentric or human-centered, so much as they revolve around the relations of mutual interdependency and necessity between humans and non-humans. The focus on human to non-human interspecies relations and the importance of the material elements of celestial phenomena in these cosmologies bears strong resemblance to the ecosystem concept developed in Western sciences beginning in the 1950s. Like indigenous eco-cosmologies, the ecosystem concept challenges rational empiricist traditions of Western science to move beyond or away from an underlying metaphor of humans as detached, distant observers to a more holistic appreciation of humans as only one part of a complex system of mutual interdependencies and energy exchanges that are regulated by informationally dense cultural and or biological processes. And here you see people capturing fish, which during the period when the rivers begin to recede and the waters go down, people are able to capture some very nice fish like this. You can see what the waters look like. They're very classy, dark color. I'll explain that later. And here we see a woman processing, well, not processing, cooking her manioc flour on a clay or a ceramic oven. Okay, so one of the other things I might say about these systems is that they are very important right now, because it has been demonstrated empirically, statistically, and beyond any doubt that the best way to protect indigenous, the Amazonian rainforest and biodiversity is to guarantee the integrity of indigenous lands. And you can see that that process was in full swing during the reign of Enrique Fernando Cardoso, 1995, but it's cut almost in half under the presidency of Luis Lula da Silva, and diminishes to a mere tenth of what it was under the presidency of Dilma Rousseff. The reason it's so important is that if you designate a large territory of Amazonian rainforest as environmentally protected area, you might as well put a sign up and say, welcome illegal loggers, illegal gold miners, and any other kind of massive destruction of the rainforest. When you create a terra indígena, an indigenous territory, you put that territory under the watchful eyes of indigenous people who have a long ancestral history on those lands. And this was just recently put out in a nice article. Some of you may be familiar with Mongabe. It's a very good environmentalist science journal with very nice science. This was a study by two PhD candidates, I believe, one at San Diego University of California, the other at Columbia University, which statistically demonstrates that indigenous territories are the best way of preserving biodiversity of the rainforest, but it only works if the government is willing to homologate these territories, namely to legally designate them as indigenous territories and put government resources into protecting them. Unfortunately, as we all know, that's not happening now in Brazil under Bolsonaro. There's also a very nice video that I would like to share. I'm only going to put a little bit of it up. Can you all see that?
Jonathan?
Yeah?
You're going to need to, will you pause the video, please?
Yes, I will.
I remember vividly.
What?
You're going to need to hit share screen.
Oh, it didn't
and
share?
then switch to the video.
It says I'm sharing the screen. Okay.
You're sharing the PowerPoint.
Oh, okay. Well, let's just stay with the PowerPoint. And I'm going to stick around. Carol, you asked me to be available afterwards. And I'm sure people already have a lot of questions like, what in the heck is he talking about? And I think we'll look at that. It's a very nice introduction to the idea that when you live with indigenous people as anthropologists and study their stories, what you see is that their understanding of the rainforest is it's not just the same as the way sort of objective Western people see it. I mean, the whole rainforest is filled with species that have stories, long stories, many stories. Okay, so introduction to the ethnology of lowland South America. Very quickly.
Jonathan,
we got to go back to share. Okay, all right, sorry. Okay, I'm going to get out of this show, I guess. Yeah, and hit share. And wow. Okay, is it being shared now?
Yes, it is.
Okay, very good. Maybe I won't do so many side trips into other websites because I didn't realize that it had to be reshared every single time. That really slows us down. We can do some of those sort of tangential things later after the talk.
Okay.
So here we have an ethnohistoric map of indigenous languages. This is a reconstruction of the approximate location of these groups. Many of them are, of course, gone. We can start by pointing out that there are more than 400 different languages spoken today. And that's after 95%, an estimated 95% of the indigenous population has been destroyed due to the influences of expanding colonial states and nation states and now multinational corporations. About half of those 400 languages can be classified into four pretty big families: the Caribs in the north, the Tupian groups along the coast and in the interior, the Jay-speaking groups along the Araguaya and to some extent the Xingu, and then the Arawak groups. I work with Arawak groups. The dark shading is the approximate distribution of Arawak-speaking peoples before the arrival of European peoples. And it was the most widely geographically distributed language group. And then there are some smaller families, sort of, you know, a dozen or so languages. And after that, it just drops down to language isolates and groups of 2 or 3 languages that can not really be called families at all. But the point I'm making is that there is tremendous linguistic diversity, considering especially how much has been done by missionaries and other outsiders to try to destroy those different languages. Now, do I have to hit share screen for this? Did this, is this website coming up? Did you all get the website?
No, what we see is still your slide.
Okay, we're gonna skip this then. I can take you to this later. What I'm looking at on my screen is the Archive of Indigenous Languages of Latin America, and in particular the Kuripaku collection of Jonathan Hill, which is where all of my originally cassette and reel-to-reel tape recordings have been digitized and put into a preservation archive at the University of Texas. Okay, and now I'm gonna try and go back to the, am I back on my screen now?
You're on this, there, you're fine.
Oh, good. Okay, now a little bit of history. It's very important to realize that contemporary indigenous Amazonian peoples are not only victims of progress today, they are survivors of a long and tortured history of the expansion of colonial and national states in Latin America into the interior. Much of this began in the early colonial period, but became much more intense in the late colonial period. Here we see a map taken from Sylvia Vidal's dissertation on the rise and fall of chiefdoms and political confederations among the Arawak-speaking peoples during the 18th century. So if you look closely, you'll see down here near Manaus, where the Rio Negro joins the Marañón, are the Manao people in 1700 to 1725, followed by the Demanao in 1725 to 1755, and then finally 1725 we get the Boape Maniba and the Madavaca in the headwaters of the Rio Negro and the Maipuri in the middle Orinoco. Well, ask yourself then, why are we seeing this pattern of people, you know, short-lived chiefdoms and confederations that are moving farther and farther upstream into remote areas? Well, the answer is quite simply European colonialism, which saw indigenous people as the source of slave labor to be extracted and taken into the plantations, sugar plantations and cotton and whatnot, in coastal and mountainous areas. And we know this started early colonial period with the Dutch and their Carib allies, followed by the Portuguese, who from colonial written records we know extracted approximately 20,000 indigenous Arawak and Tucanoan speaking peoples from the upper Rio Negro and took them thousands of kilometers downstream to work in plantations. And then finally, in the very late colonial period, at approximately the 1750s, the Spanish arrived and established forts and mission settlements at key locations in the upper Rio Negro. Around the same time, in the other side of the Amazon basin, on the southern end of the the Xingu River, which flows from south to north, was the coming together, or ethnogenesis, we call it, of a number of different language groups. The blue Arawakan groups like Wausha, the yellow or orange Tupian groups like the Kamayura, and the pink Carib-speaking groups like the Kalapalo, came together in this very unique cultural synthesis. This is one of the greatest living examples of cultural diversity and linguistic diversity, multilingual networks. Just to the north of that, along the middle Xingu and the Araguaia River, is the territory of a variety of other indigenous groups, mostly Jay-speaking groups like the Kayapo. And we're going to meet the Kayapo again in just a few moments. Okay, so in contrast to these very well-adapted, sustainable indigenous communities, we find many of the contemporary practices of modern society are extremely maladaptive in the tropical rainforest environments. Maladaptive cultural structures can be defined as humanly constructed systems that place higher value on short-term maximization of resource extraction than on long-term survival. Again, it's this perpetual growth economy model of, okay, well, destroyed the whales, let's go to, destroy some other species. We'll just extract and extract and extract. I call it predatory extractive economic system. And this includes the resources include human labor as slaves, and indigenous people were the first enslaved laborers in the colonial period. And when it turned out that they were very quickly diminished to about 5% of their 5 to 10% of their original population, well, then the Europeans began going over to Africa and bringing in massive shipments of West African slave labor. And so I'm going to start with going back to 2011. In January of 2011, Dilma Rousseff, the first woman to be elected president of Brazil, was inaugurated. And many people had great hopes that Brazil might turn away from environmentally and socially destructive forms of development, such as the Belo Monte Dam, a diagram of which you're looking at right now. The world's third largest hydroelectric dam at Belo Monte on the lower Xingu River. In the inaugural speech, Rousseff spoke of continuing the legacy of President Lula da Silva as a time when we Brazilians crossed over to another shore of history. And she skillfully interwove environmentally friendly language with the kind of instrumentalist techno-bankster econo-speak that's become so prevalent in the early years of the 21st century. I think here of Alan Greenspan's infamous phrase, irrational exuberance. Rousseff viewed scientific research and technological innovation as an instrument of productivity, ignoring the fact that national and international associations of environmental and social science had unanimously condemned the Belo Monte project as an intentional man-made disaster, or worse, a weapon of mass destruction that would destroy biodiversity as well as sustainable, culturally diverse lifeways whose survival depends on that biodiversity. A myriad of scientific, indigenous, and popular voices spoke out against the relentless determination to implement Belo Monte, but by June of 2011, the Brazilian government had licensed the project and made it unmistakably clear that it was determined to move ahead with granting a license to the multi-billion-dollar corporations that were building the enormous hydroelectric dam. As president-elect of SALSA in 2011, and SALSA stands, I know you guys think that's salsa is something you dip your corn chips into or that you do on a dance floor, but in fact, SALSA, I'm here to tell you, stands for the Society for the Anthropology of Lowlands South America, SALSA. And we are a proud scientific organization with about a third of our members coming from Brazil and other Latin American countries, a third from Europe, and a third from North America. And as president-elect, I argued that it was important for our organization to make a public statement of opposition to the building of the dam, in spite of, or perhaps even because of, the government's decision to grant a license allowing the dam's construction to begin. And so we crafted a letter signed by my predecessor, Beth Conklin, professor at Vanderbilt, we said, we believe that the project would have disastrous social, cultural, ecological, economic, and political effects on indigenous and other people living along the Xingu River. It would destroy a large segment of tropical rainforest in one of the most important river basins in the world. The northern Kayapo people of central Brazil, who live in regions along the middle Xingu River, and here you see several northern Kayapo leaders, and they had led a successful multi-ethnic resistance to the building of a hydroelectric dam in that same area in 1989. They also played a very strong role 2 decades later in resistance to the building of the hydroelectric dam at Belo Monte. In opposing the Belo Monte project, the Kayapo joined with other indigenous groups from the Upper Xingu, various other regions of Brazil as members of a national organization of indigenous peoples. The most important and vocal civic organization to oppose the building of Belo Monte Dam and was and still is the Xingu Lives Forever, Xingu Vivo para Sempre. You can see that in the background here. And here you see Ropney, the chief Ropney is a major international figure in environmental organizing. He went on tours with the rock musician Sting in the 90s and raised money for implementing the protection of indigenous Kayapo lands. It says, Dilma Rousseff, the president, respect the people of the Xingu, stop Belo Monte. And then what also was somewhat different in the era of Dilma Rousseff was that it began to spread into cities. A movement, an environmental movement in Brazil began to grow, a green movement, especially among young people. Here is a group, I believe this is in the city of Belém near the mouth of the Amazon, calling for stopping the building of the hydroelectric dam. Here you see indigenous leaders as well as a variety of scientists and political figures holding a banner to stop the building of the Belo Monte Dam in the Amazon. Not only did these collective expressions of concern and opposition fail to stop the Belo Monte project from going forward, but the Brazilian government proceeded to implement a growth acceleration program calling for the building of 25 large hydroelectric dams in addition to hundreds of small hydroelectric plants at the expense of indigenous communities. Now, I single out the hydroelectric dams. Of course, there are many other forms of environmental degradation taking place. We all saw pictures of the rainforest on fire when Bolsonaro gave a green light to all the landless people that they wanted to go in and burn down sections of the rainforest about a year ago. Cattle ranching, agribusiness, road building, railroads, illegal logging, illegal gold mining, land speculation, all of that. But hydroelectric dams, in my view, must be singled out as especially harmful since they destroy the ecology of aquatic rivers and the riverine life forms and their ability to gain seasonal access to the flooded forest. So if Amazonian rainforest can be considered to act as the lungs of the world, then the rivers that annually flood and drain these forests must be regarded as the arteries and veins that nurture and rejuvenate the atmosphere's ability to breathe. Hydroelectric dams destroy this natural circulatory system and replace sustainable human communities with a form of energy production that is neither clean nor sustainable. And I'm just going to comment that well, here we'll look at a few slides. This is what the dam looked like shortly after it was built, and it filled with water. What they didn't consider, they thought there would be more water entering the basin to fill the lake above the dam because of the deforestation along the middle and lower regions of the Xingu. What they didn't take into account is that this deforestation has been so massive that it has resulted in climate change, and there are now droughts in areas that used to be highly moist rainforest, biodiverse rainforest. And so the water level has fallen so low that it is now lapping up against the earthen berm, which is underneath the concrete structure. Okay, so underneath that is an earthen berm, and it is eroding that berm to such an extent that they are now afraid that the whole thing is going to collapse and that people downstream will perish. So here we see the indigenous people, how they hunt and fish along the rivers. What happens to those rivers when you permanently flood them is you destroy all the vegetation, and it slowly rots and gives off vast amounts of methane gas. So it's a major cause of climate change, along with the burning of the rainforests. These are Ribeirinho people. They're descendants of rubber tappers from the 1870s and late 19th century and early 20th century. Their ancestors had established sustainable communities based on fishing and farming and collecting of forest resources, which is now destroyed, been completely destroyed. They organized themselves into a group of Ribeirinhos. Okay, in the remaining time, I hope I've got a little bit of time left now to talk about my work with the eco-cosmology of the Coripacu, a fishing and gardening society of the Upper Xingu region in Venezuela, Colombia, and Brazil. They speak an Arawakan language. They have a sedentary, internally ranked social system, which is very hierarchical, based on ritual, differential access to and control over ritual power and mythic knowledge. They have specialists known as chant owners, or marikaili, minali, and shamans. The villages are established on the riverbanks, areas that don't flood in wet seasons, to exploit natural migratory patterns of fish and other aquatic animal species as the rivers rise and fall 7 meters during the alternation between wet and dry seasons. And we're very close to the equator here, about 2 degrees north, so there's not really any true dry season. There is a very wet season and a somewhat less very wet season. Bitter manat cultivation on nutrient-poor anthrosols is highly efficient. As I said before, it gets 10 calories out for 1 in, even on these very sandy, acidic soils. I was there in 1980 and 81 for a prolonged period of dissertation research on ritual metacommunication. I did postdoctoral studies in 1983, 84, and 85, looking at a regional system of extra local factors, education, healthcare, and all these other things that were affecting the contemporary indigenous population. In 93 and 96, I did ethnohistorical and archaeological work. And then in 98, I returned for 6 months to do work specifically on the mythic tricksters. The territory is about evenly distributed between Brazil down here, Colombia up here and over here, and Venezuela. I worked up here in Venezuela. The ecosystem is very nutrient poor. It's called a white sand, black water ecosystem. The black comes from humic acids that leach out of the diverse plants that live in the rainforest. These are very geologically ancient soils, part of the western edge of the Guyana Shield. People make their villages like this on islands or on the banks of the rivers so they can exploit the rising and falling of the river. It goes up and down 7 meters. Traditionally, they had communal longhouses, but those were destroyed by the Catholic missionaries and the Protestant missionaries because they felt that it was, they understood that those structures were more than just social domiciles for people to live in. They were also places of worship or temples. The rivers flood around the end of March, early April. They go 7 meters up in a short period of time when the rains become heavy. And 70% of the rainforest goes underwater. The aquatic animals, and particularly fish, depend for their long-term survival on access to these flooded forests. They go up and they feed on the plant and insects that are on the bottom of the flooded forest, and they spawn and reproduce there before migrating back into the main channels of the river. So, what are the stories that the Coripacu people tell? They begin with the primordial times of the trickster creator, which is a period when this trickster named Made from Bone survives a number of his adversaries' attempts to kill him. These are animal affines or in-laws. They try to drown him. They try to burn him alive. They try to shoot him with arrows. They try to poison him. They try to strangle him with vines. They try every possible means. And the trickster is always able to escape and turn the tables on his adversaries because he knows in advance what they're going to do. So here I want to play for you an example of what one of their narratives sounds like. This is one where inappropriately the maid from Bone is fighting against an anaconda person who's messing around with his wife. Can I ask Carol, is that sound level okay?
No, I wasn't able to understand. It was like too loud. It was
It was
garbage.
too loud? Okay, I've got it way down. Okay, let's try it again. Oh, it doesn't want to play now.
Didn't hear it.
I know. Okay, now it's inaudible. Okay.
You hear it?
No, is it in another language?
It's in the Kuripaku language. It's an Arawakan language.
Oh, that's probably why we don't understand it.
Yeah, you're not gonna. But if you look, I have an interlinear English translation that goes with it. Let's listen. I just want to say how important all these sound effects are and things that the man who's telling this story was a masterful storyteller. I was very fortunate to work with the last generation of truly oral tradition. He was a master poet, and he would always weave in these beautiful sound effects, and that we have to realize that, you know, this is like their form, not only their form of sacred narrative, but it's also their entertainment. A lot of these stories are their version of what we now have Netflix and movies and other forms of entertainment. Okay, so here's another quick example, and then we'll move on. My favorite sound, bulyu. Bulyu is the sound of the anaconda person submerging into the river. Okay, so that gives you an idea of how the world begins. The world begins as a violent, ceaselessly violent struggle between Trickster and his enemies, but Trickster always wins. And by the end of this period, the Trickster is kind of this heroic figure who goes around and gets things for people in the future. Like there's no nighttime for people to sleep. They had to work all the time because it was always day, so they couldn't relax. So he gets night, he gets cooking fire, and most importantly, he gets what's called Matsurukai. Matsurukai is a genre of ceremonial singing, dancing, and instrumental music that transforms fear and hostility into intercommunal relations based on respect and reciprocity. So for the first time in their mythic history, we see the emergence of human social interaction. And so let's go look at how that worked out. Real briefly, they had a tradition of ceremonial exchange called pudali, in which a gift of smoked fish and game meat would be given to an in-law group or a potential in-law group, and then that was returned in a form of balanced reciprocity with a gift of processed manioc pulp. And the thing that triggers the ceremonial cycle is when there is a superabundance of smoked fish and game. This happens regularly at the beginning of the long wet season. And that's because the fish migrate up into the newly flooded forest, and then they return after spawning. They return and are captured in massive quantities as they return to the main channel of the river. The sound of a river teeming with migrating, spawning fish is then replicated in the sound made by these ceremonial trumpets, which are played together with long flutes called the yaparutu or Maui flutes. So let's. Okay, so that, I don't know how well you could hear that. You need kind of like large speakers and a sound system and everything to hear the low rumbling bass sound. But that's the general idea, is that the ceremonial exchanges between communities, which is the basis of human social reproduction in history, is directly connected to the reproduction of the fish species that spawn and migrate into the flooded forest. This is a picture. I learned how to play these Maui flutes. That's me 40 years ago, weighing slightly less. If you ever want to lose weight, go to the Rio Negro, folks, because they don't call it the river of hunger for no reason. And I made a lot of transcriptions of music while I was in the field, and that gave me the ability to see what's going on. So that to a Western ear probably sounds like, okay, somebody raised their hand. Do we have to do something about that?
We can wait till you're done and then we'll take the question.
Yeah, otherwise, I'm pretty close to finish. What might sound like just mere repetition is in fact filled with all kinds of theme and variation. There are 23 different variants of the same theme. The basic theme is this da da dee da 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 da, and that's repeated 1, 2, 3, almost 20 times. But then there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 variants of that particular theme. And then there's a shorter version of the theme that's played, one version of which is played 15 times. And there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 different ones, and so forth. Same thing here, a little less, a little more variety actually. But what I like about this is it shows the stabilizing process of musical sound, because you create a very central, stable sort of pillar of sound, and then you put a lot of variation around that, which that to me is very important as the source of the creativity, the improvisation, and I call it the musicalization, the transformations in sound that are very important for understanding how their worldview connects to non-human or other than human rainforest species diversity. So finally, we get to the third and last stage of the mythic history, and that is the creation of the primordial human being whose voice opens up the world, the naming of all the different species and objects of nature, not only naming, but chanting and singing of the names, which I call musical naming power, happens during the life cycle of this primordial human being who's taken away to a corner of the sky. And then the trickster sends up a messenger, a wasp person messenger named Kalimatu, and asks him, if he will reveal his secret and come down and teach his musical naming power to Zuli, the first chant owner. And he says, I'm going to play a little bit of that just to see, so you can see what it sounds like. Okay, I'm going to skip over the rest of that, but it's very important because that's where he says, tell Trickster that he cannot kill me with machetes. I am machetes. My body is made of machetes. He cannot kill me with poison. My hair is made of poison, and so forth through this whole list, a very poetic listing of all the different elements that might be used to kill him, but that in fact cannot kill him. The one thing, however, he says that can kill him is fire. So of course, he goes to the village down below and teaches the sacred singing and chanting called Malikai to the first chant owner, the brother of the trickster. And at the end of the night, the trickster and the other brothers dance with the primordial human being around the fire, push him into the bonfire, and the world shrinks back to its original size. But like so many myths about the death of a child, it's really about the making way for the adult person to emerge. It's about a transformation from childhood to adulthood, not about a death per se, a metaphorical death perhaps. And then out of the ashes of this primordial human being, there are trees and vines that are cut down by Trickster, who creates the sacred flutes and trumpets that are used by groups of men in rituals. They are stolen by the mother of the primordial human being, and she and her female friends take the trumpets and flutes and play them in different parts of the world, and the world opens up for a second time, which in many ways, this is the model for understanding indigenous understandings of historical change, the creation of a world of different peoples and places. And it isn't just a single movement away from the center of mythic space and back, but it's like a series of movements over long distances away from the center and back, which actually makes perfect sense when you look at the map and you see how widespread the Arawak language family really is. There must have been times when there were major expansions of the Arawak speaking diaspora, if you want to call it that. And this is to give you just a real quick sample, and we'll be done, of what it sounds like. Okay, so and then here's the singing and chanting for female initiation. Okay, I don't know if you could hear it, but in the chants for the newborn infant's father, all of his tools and weapons have to be blessed through this chanting, and it's a combination of spoken and chanted speech. And in the chants for the female initiation, it starts as sung speech and then modulates into chanted speech. It goes on for about 6 or 7 hours, and I don't think we have time to listen to the whole thing. So anyhow, it's a very major and important ceremony for a ritual for each individual person. And the important thing is that it's very difficult for us to categorize these as either chants or songs. They're combinations of ritually powerful chanted, sung, and spoken discourse or speech. And I've done a lot of study. I'm not going to take time to go into the details of this. I've done books and articles about this for the last 30 or 40 years. This is a process of stabilizing, using the names, the spirit names, to sort of create stable places. And then the more dynamic process I call musicalization is a movement across different categories of mythic spirits in very rapid fashion. Okay, so to end this part of the talk, then we get the music. This music was recorded in 1985 when there was a major male initiation ritual. I wasn't present. I had left a tape recorder in 1984 in the village with the son of this powerful chant owner at their request. And I said, well, hey, why are you using that to help memorize all the spirit names? Would you mind making recordings? And he made a beautiful set of recordings, which are also in the archives of indigenous languages of Latin America, of the entire male initiation ritual. And this final recording was in some ways the best because he left the microphone run, the tape recorder run with the men getting into a canoe, and there's never a break. They playing their flutes and moving away from the village. And so you hear them sort of slowly fading out. Let's listen to it. I'll just fast forward this so we. Oops. Oh, heck. Here, let's try that one more time. I know. Okay, you get the idea. Basically, when I first listened to that recording in 1985, when I went back down to the field, I was listening to it with my indigenous collaborator. This is a good example of what we call collaborative ethnopoetics or ethnomusicology. He says to me, he said, well, what do you think of that? And I'm like, wow, that is beautiful. You know, it's like, I was thinking it was just a beautiful ethno-aesthetic effect. But in fact, as I worked on these rituals and music and myths over the years, I began to realize that really is not just an aesthetic effect. It is what the ritual is all about. The movement of these musical instruments and the sounds that they make across the rivers, this opening up of the world through the movement of musical sounds across the rivers and rainforests. Okay, acknowledgements, blah, blah, blah. Those are the research foundations. I want to finish with a couple of concluding thoughts. I know I'm running a little bit long here. I'm going to just mention a few. I think we need to, first of all, abandon these older stereotypes of indigenous Amazonian peoples as less than fully human beings who are frozen in time as either lawless savages or noble savages living in some state of anarchy or innocent nature, and replace these with understandings of their own cultural practices, their stories, as ongoing processes of poetically transforming species and materials of the other than human environment into fully human beings and social relations. These are dynamic ecocosmologies. They have provided indigenous peoples with the cultural and linguistic tools for resiliently transforming their social worlds across 5 centuries of colonial and national state expansions that have unleashed pandemics of old world diseases, including COVID right now, of course, military conquest, enslavement, assimilationist ideologies, forced labor campaigns, and in some cases, even genocide. With increasing evidence that global climate change is happening at an accelerated pace, it's time for nation states to let go of programs for accelerated growth that are based on an economic model of perpetual growth, and replace them with plans for constructing political economies based on sustainable communities. Indigenous ecocosmologies of small-scale technologically simple societies cannot be simply amplified or extrapolated directly to the large-scale economies of high-energy cultures, densely populated nation states, and large urban centers. However, these indigenous worldviews can provide contemporary humanity with general principles or guidelines for developing policies that would steer away from perpetual growth and in the direction of sustainable communities. Indigenous cosmologies start from the understanding of human beings as integral parts of a multi-species web of living beings. And this network of organic life forms is seen as interdependent with non-organic elements like water and sunlight, as well as natural phenomena such as the seasonal rising and falling of river levels. The cultural separateness of humanity is never absolute, but is always defined in relation to or constructed out of the mythic primordium of animal humans. The economic practices supported by indigenous ecocosmologies are survival-oriented rather than yield or profit maximizing. Small-scale fishing and horticultural economies like that of my Kuripaku collaborators and interlocutors are capable of persisting for as long as the rivers continue to flood their banks and forests are allowed to replenish soil nutrients and nourish aquatic life forms. In theory, this kind of subsistence economy can last as long as the solar system. So it's time, at the very least, to stop destroying them. National governments, NGOs, international agencies need to formulate policies and implement programs that allow indigenous communities to participate in commercial economies in ways that are ecologically sustainable, such as agroforestry, and that do not damage the delicate interdependencies between aquatic life forms and areas of seasonally flooded forests and grasslands. Indigenous peoples who live in remotely situated forests must be allowed to continue living in voluntary isolation as part of their universal right to self-determination. The relentless assimilationist policies of the past, which relied on missionaries and other culture-bound agents as the state's representatives to indigenous peoples, need to be replaced with educational programs that support indigenous ecocosmologies and languages at the same time as they introduce knowledge and skills from Western sciences and humanities that will provide tools necessary for their navigation of the contemporary world. National systems of formal education must valorize the sociocultural and linguistic diversity of indigenous communities in lowland South America as a positive force in the struggle to protect Amazonian rivers and forests, rather than ignore or even denigrate them as obstacles to economic growth. And above all, nationalist histories rooted in centuries-old racist narratives of the West taming the rest need to be replaced with accurate understandings of the tremendous losses that indigenous peoples have endured during the expansion of colonial and national states, as well as the cultural creativities that have allowed indigenous peoples, their worldviews, and their languages to persist and flourish in the rapidly changing global order of the 21st century. And as a final afterthought or epilogue, I've been reading a book called Braiding Sweetgrass. I don't know if y'all can see that, but it's by Robin Wall Kimmerer. She's a Native American who's also a scientist and ecologist. And she quotes from an author, Gary Nabhan, about the necessity of restoring our relationship with the land that he calls restoration, changing the narrative. We cannot meaningfully proceed with healing, with restoration, without restoration. In other words, our relationship with land cannot heal until we hear its stories. But who will tell them?